No doubt you've been watching the news lately, and one of the big items that we've noted on the international scene is how that just in the last week or so that the population of Ireland has decided to remove an amendment from their constitution that prohibited abortion. And you've probably read that. What I find interesting about that is that, well, there's a lot of things, but one thing in particular is that particular amendment was only added to the Irish Constitution in 1983, when most of the rest of the world was busily legalizing abortion. They actually put it within their Constitution to prohibit it. Yet, here we are, within a generation, within just a few short years, the entire population is doing a complete 180 in terms of its preferences around such a controversial issue just like this. As if we needed to be reminded, this is just one more reminder that Christendom is dead. Now, what I mean by Christendom is that the day when a Christian consensus organizes our cultural understanding, that day is gone. It's past. Now, that's hardly a blinding flash to anybody, is it? I hope I haven't burst anybody's bubble this morning, but I think sometimes we need to acknowledge reality. And that Christian consensus has gone out of not just Ireland, but out of our own culture as well. And many of us of a certain vintage are surprised, shocked, maybe even grieve this development. In a relatively short time, we've seen so much in our culture shift. We've seen the total commercialization of Sundays. We've seen the open disdain and even mockery of Christian values. We see things that were once shamefully hidden, now celebrated in the streets. And when you look at all this, the question for us is not, how do we get our culture back? That's not the question we need to ask. Rather, the real question is, how do we as believers now live in a culture that increasingly moves away from everything that we hold value and value? How do we live faithfully in a culture that I think will become increasingly hostile to all that we hold dear? Well, I'm not going to give you 3 quick answers to how that's all going to be solved, because there are no easy answers around this sort of thing. How do we live faithfully, honoring Christ in just such a time as this? How do we live in this world and yet not be of this world? Well, I start with all that because to begin to answer these kind of questions, over the coming weeks, we're going to be revisiting the book of Daniel. I want us to spend some time wrestling and reviewing the incidents that happened in his life. Too, as we do this, as you can see, I'm calling this series Faith Under Pressure. It's faith under pressure because that is exactly what Daniel and his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego experienced. So let's get into Daniel's story first by setting the context in the opening verses of Daniel. So Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 to 7, we read these things. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table, and they were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. Now, as we begin to get into Daniel's story, it begins, obviously, with Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, attacking and capturing Jerusalem. And this event happened sometime in the 6th century BC. You can appreciate this is a disaster for not only for the people of Judah, but for Daniel and his friends and all the people of Jerusalem. This foreign power had come in, decimated their city, and carried off the best and the brightest among them. They'd been overrun and sacked by a pagan king. But here's the sobering part. As Daniel made clear, the Lord handed Jerusalem and the king into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. The Lord had done this. I find that sobering. It's interesting, though, that this development is exactly what prophets like Jeremiah had warned about would happen if Israel and Judah did not pay attention and heed the call of the prophets. The prophets repeatedly, Israel had already been wiped off the map, but now Judah had been under the same threat, and the Lord kept saying to them, do not follow other gods to serve and worship them. But then, as Jeremiah says in chapter 25, but you did not listen to me, declares the Lord, and you have provoked me with what your hands have made. Then he goes on, Jeremiah continues, therefore the Lord Almighty says this, because you have not listened to my words, I will summon all the peoples of the north, and my servant Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, declares the Lord. And I will bring them against this land and its inhabitants and against all the surrounding nations. And I will completely destroy them and make them an object of horror and scorn and everlasting ruin. Yikes. 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 This disaster was God's judgment on Judah's idolatry and faithlessness. You know, this incident reminds me of something that I read of Phil Yancey a while back, where he wrote, God seems to value character more than our comfort, often using the very elements that cause us the most discomfort as his tools in fashioning that character. And beloved, that was especially true of Daniel and his friends. It is in the furnace of adversity in pagan Babylon that he has his godly character formed and shaped. You know, as I look at this, even just this opening, there are some remarkable things to see. First of all, I don't know what your picture of Daniel is, but you need to realize that Daniel and these guys were exceptional young men. They're without physical defect, handsome, intelligent, well-informed, quick to understand. You know, all those things Cheryl says to me every day. You know, that just before I wake up. And but these guys were exceptional young men. And that's what's even more impressive about these. You need to realize these guys were teenagers. These weren't adult men. These were teenagers who were being carried off into this exile in Babylon. Two, once they were in Babylon, they are forced into a process of assimilation into Babylonian culture. They go into this process, and the purpose of this process was for them to forget all about their Jewishness and become useful subjects of Babylon. And this process of assimilation was going to force Daniel to accept some things that he might not ever wish to in his life. He was going to be required to do some compromising in his life. I know that that's often it gets a bad rap in our Christian circles, but here's Daniel being forced to make some compromises and to submit to certain repugnant requirements in his life. And I imagine all the time wrestling, how far can I bend without breaking my faith? As we look closely, we may be shocked at how far Daniel was willing to bend. First of all, he received a new name. His name, Daniel, means God is my judge. But that name got changed to Belteshazzar, which means Bel's prince. Bel being one of the demonic gods of Babylon. He received a thorough Babylonian education that immersed him in a foreign and totally different worldview than his Jewish heritage. And that education included large doses of the occult and even astrology. Daniel was being educated to serve among the certified enchanters and magicians in Nebuchadnezzar's court. Think about that. Sometimes we hear things that are going on in our own educational system, and we think, how could that be happening here? And then you think, we get really wound up about it. But let me tell you, we've not faced anything like Daniel was experiencing in the educational system that he got put into. Two, as we look at Daniel's life, he's lost so much. He's lost the security and the privileges of home. He's lost the ability to decide what his future will be. He's lost the culture that supported and nurtured his faith. And probably worst of all, in all probability, he lost his manhood. It's not specifically stated, but the usual practice of despotic kings was for those males in their court to be made eunuchs, so they'd be safe. As you go through Daniel, there's no record of him ever marrying. Many believe the implication was he was made a eunuch. He's lost a lot in his life. On the surface, Daniel has lost so much. It looks as though he is powerless under a despotic pagan ruler. I assure you, Daniel was not trying to figure out how to make Babylon godly. He was wrestling with, how do I remain godly in Babylon? And hence, we see that unfolding as we go through this amazing book. Now, we mentioned that Daniel had to do some compromising. He had to do some bending. But there came a day when Daniel and company drew a line in the sand and said, we will not bend here. Let's read further in Daniel, picking up at verse 8 from chapter 1. Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for his permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. Daniel drew a line over food. Now, some people looking at that think, he's bent so much. What is it about this thing that caused him to say, I can't go further than this? Well, some have suggested he was keeping the kosher laws. And perhaps, but I don't think that's it. I think there was something deeper going on here. I think that he was trying to respond faithfully to something that Nebuchadnezzar was up to. See, with all the education and training that Nebuchadnezzar was putting these young men and all those young men who had been brought to him from their conquered nations, Nebuchadnezzar was trying to send a message. He was trying to send a message to say, you know, if you go along, if you just fit in, if you just receive what I'm offering, things will go well with you. As a matter of fact, you can even flourish here. You can go a long way in this system if you'll just go along. For those who cooperate and go along, good things can happen. Nebuchadnezzar is mighty, and he can be gracious. And as a result, people should be very grateful. They should say to all those around them, all that I am, I owe to Nebuchadnezzar. Beloved, I think in refusing the king's rich food, Daniel was fighting against that message. He was fighting against, and he was pushing back against that thought that all that I am is because of Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel's thoughts were probably something like this: God has placed me here for some reason that I don't fully comprehend. I need to remember him. I need a daily reminder that I am not my own, that whatever I accomplish is from God alone. And I need to remind myself that it is God and not Nebuchadnezzar who is the source of my well-being. And so it came about that Daniel chose to take a stand on food. And as we know, God gave Daniel and his friends favor and blessed this decision. So much so that at the end of the 3 years when Nebuchadnezzar come to examine them, they were 10 times ahead of all the others. So we hear this story, and we ask, where does this story of Daniel lead us? Particularly as we wrestle with living faithfully in a hostile culture. Well, I'll suggest 3 things. First of all, it suggests to us that in the midst of whatever story we're in at the moment, we need to remember that our story is only a part of a much greater story that we are a part of as well. See, the focus here is on Daniel, and that the book carries his name, and it seems like that this is supposed to be all about Daniel and his circumstances. But as you read the book of Daniel closely, you realize the story is really about God. The story is really about God expressing His sovereign rule over even pagan situations. That God is saying that He's not just some tribal deity that only has effectiveness over in Israel, but that He is the Lord of all nations. And that every king, no matter how powerful, no matter how majestic, no matter how much sway he holds over people and land, that he still bows his knee to a greater one. And Daniel is going to be the means by which God expresses His sovereignty even in evil Babylon. Oh yes, there's no doubt Nebuchadnezzar has great power. There's no doubt that he is on the surface ruling the day and ruling the lives of people. But ultimately, it is God who is in control. It's God who's in control. It's not Nebuchadnezzar. And whatever situation you find yourself in, no matter how much of a brutal boss you might have, or no matter how much of an ugly situation you might find yourself in, no matter how much you might be oppressed by certain circumstances, you need to know that that's only temporary. God is in control. God is in control. And as Daniel lived out his days in this challenging environment, he sought to always keep that truth, that story before him. Because he was not living Nebuchadnezzar's story. He was living God's story in a foreign land. Whatever your current circumstances, my friend, which story is your life being determined by? A second principle that we get from Daniel, and this is perhaps the most challenging and perhaps even the most controversial. There will be times in our faithfulness and in our walk with the Lord that we will have to prayerfully discern how far can we bend without breaking faith. How far can we go? Can I say, Daniel did a lot of bending. Sometimes when you stop and you consider what he experienced and what he put up with, you think, wow. There are no easy rules for this. Each circumstance and situation can be different and it can be difficult. But, beloved, Christians have always had to make such awkward, hard choices. It started early on in Corinth. There were some who were wrestling with the whole issue about meat sacrificed to idols. Some were saying, you can't touch that stuff. That's been to the temple. That's been sacrificed to some pagan god. You can't eat that. Others were saying, that doesn't mean anything to me. Those gods are nothing. Forget that. I'm going to eat what I want to. And Paul comes along and says, well, look, you need to realize that one man's conscience allows him to eat that stuff, but another man's doesn't. It's a dilemma. You're going to have to make a choice. What will allow your what can you do in faith? What will your conscience allow you to how will your conscience allow you to bend in this circumstance? In the early centuries of Christianity, Christians had to wrestle whether a Christian could be a Roman soldier. During World War II, Dietrich Bonhoeffer agonized over whether he could be, as a Christian, be part of the plot to assassinate Hitler. A little closer to our time. Should a Christian baker bake a cake for a same-sex wedding? I think Christian politicians face this all the time. We sit out here and wag our fingers and think, oh, those guys are so perhaps they're in such challenging situations as believers that maybe they do need to bend sometimes. Not because they want to, but how they're trying to balance their faith with the democratic demands of their constituency. And that's not easy. It's challenging. How far can they bend without breaking faith? And beloved, you'll be in those kind of situations. And I wish I could give you, well, here's 3 steps that you do these 3 steps and it'll be as clear as mud what you ought to do. I assure you, it'll be clear as mud. And sometimes you're just going to have to pray deeply and act as faithfully as you believe you can. And you need to realize that there will be times that whatever you decide to do won't be perfect. It won't be pure. It'll be what the situation perhaps may require. Is that controversial? It is. It is. It is. Because I have to admit, from the early Christian, from my early Christian walk, I've been basically taught no compromise. And I still believe that. I believe that there are times you've got to draw a line in the sand and not give in. But the older I've gotten, there are a lot of lines that I used to draw that I don't draw anymore. There are some hills that just are not worth dying on. There are some hills where it's just not worth the aggro and, in the end of the day, the witness of Christ being so besmirched because of my obstinance around this particular issue. Now, where I'm at on any given issue might be different from where you're at. Again, it goes back to what does my Spirit-guided conscience allow me to do and not allow me to do. That's where we do have to take seriously the ministry of the Spirit in those times. And sometimes the situation will require, like it did Daniel, for us to bend. But ultimately, and this is the third thing, there are times when we'll have to decide how far is too far, and then stand. Then stand. Being prepared to live with the consequences. This is the thing that strikes me about Daniel and his friends as we go through this, is that several times they draw a line. And almost in every one of those circumstances, as they drew that line, their lives were under threat. The consequences were real. And when you've got a capricious despot like Nebuchadnezzar, all he has to do is snap his fingers and you're done. So there was a real threat around making these kind of stands. Some hills are worth dying on, my friends. And it's discerning by the prompting of the Spirit where that lies. There will be certain parts of your faith upon which you cannot compromise. You're not going to be able to say that Allah is Lord. There are certain things you're not going to be able to do. You're not going to be able to bow your knee and to worship in certain ways. See, Daniel and his friends, often their refusals, their stands revolved around who it is that was going to be worshipped. Who it is that we're going to acknowledge is actually in control. There are certain express commands of God that you will not be able to violate. It's interesting, we learned that from Jesus. Jesus, I think, made a lot of compromises, as he went along. He put up with a lot of stuff. But here we are, living out his story. His story that there eventually came that point where his submission to God's purposes and God's will required him to pay the full cost and the full consequences of taking a stand for you and me. And he did that willingly, trusting that God would vindicate his trust. And beloved, at the end of the day, this was Daniel. At the end of the day, this is us. Because we are living out of that bigger story, we're saying no matter what happens, no matter what the consequences are in my life, I have one who oversees my life and who is at work in my life and has promised me a day when my faith will be rewarded and he will be my vindicator. And I'm going to stand in that place and trust him, even if it costs me dearly. Are there places in your life where you will say, here I stand, I can do no other? How many of you have sung that song, Dare to be a Daniel? I think that what we've talked about today is a little bit different than what often comes out of that song. But nonetheless, I believe that God has included this story of Daniel to hold him up as a remarkable, unique expression of faithfulness, even in times where faith was under great, great pressure. I pray that in the coming weeks, as we look at Daniel and his friends, we'll learn to do that a little bit better ourselves. Let's pray. Lord, I pray that what I've represented here reflects Daniel's heart, but even more important, Lord, has reflected you. Lord, we wrestle with the latitude that Daniel felt he could enter into. Yet, Lord, you considered him faithful. Yet, Lord, in the midst of that, you showed up. In the midst of all of that, your grace was upon him. And he experienced marvelous things. So, Lord, we pray that the lessons that you have for us from Daniel, you'll help us to learn and help us to incorporate them into our lives. So that, Lord, even in our own challenging days, we might live faithfully, that we might honor you. Lord, we believe. Help us in our unbelief. In Jesus' name. Amen. I heard somebody say this week, those of us who look back and think, oh, if we could only go back to that time and the way things were there, would probably be shocked, that if we went back and talked to the leaders there, they'd probably be really surprised that we're looking back on their time as some kind of golden time of faith, because they too had their own stuff. It's never been any different, my friends. We shouldn't be surprised that God has allowed us to be in this time, in this place, and in these circumstances. Our call is just to learn how to walk faithfully, to honor God, to love him with all our hearts, even in the midst of some really dicey and challenging stuff. May the Spirit of God be with you this week as you walk into all kinds of circumstances. May the Spirit of God be informing your responses, and may you have a real sense of God's delight over you as you seek to be the most faithful you can in those circumstances. God bless you, my friends. Have a great week.